The fluorescent lights hummed above Trauma Bay 3 as Hannah Clarke methodical prepared the crash cart for the third time that shift, each for line coiled with the precision of someone who once worked under mortar fire in a place most people only knew from news reports. Her hands moved without hesitation, 14-gauge angiocath needles arranged in ascending order, medications organized by class, the defibrillator pads checked and rechecked. The younger nurses watched her sometimes, the way her fingers never trembled during codes, the way she assessed a trauma patient's airway with something that looked like muscle memory. They didn't ask questions. Sacred Heart's ER had learned not to ask Hannah Clarke questions. She wore her scrubs loose across the shoulders, deliberate folds of fabric that hid the silver scars snaking down her left side like lightning frozen in skin. Bagram had given her those scars. Shrapnel from a compound explosion in 2015, the kind that killed 2 of her soldiers and nearly killed her. The kind that ended a career she never discussed with anyone, not the nurses, not the physicians, not even Dr. Morrison when she'd first applied for the position 3 years ago. Sacred Heart knew her as competent, quiet, dependable. The nurse who moved through crises the way other people moved through grocery stores. They did not need to know the rest. At 6:08 p.m., during a moment when the ER held its breath between traumas, Hannah reached inside her jacket and touched the patch sewn into the lining. The faded 7th Special Forces Group emblem, dull green thread on darker green fabric, one of the only pieces of that world she'd kept. Her finger traced the outline once, a ritual so practiced it took less than a second. One of the techs passed and didn't notice. No one ever noticed. The doors burst open at 6:52. Paramedic Reeves wheeled the stretcher with the controlled urgency of someone who'd seen this particular emergency before. 63-year-old male, multiple stab wounds to the abdomen, one penetrating wound to the left flank, approximately 45 minutes pre-hospital time. His voice carried the particular flatness of someone reporting on the already dying. Blood pressure's been dropping since pickup. Started at 94/61. Now at 68/40. The unconscious veteran lay motionless, his shirt already cut away, bandages soaked through with a dark burgundy that meant serious blood loss. The kind that killed people in minutes if you didn't move fast. Hannah's entire nervous system shifted. The quiet dissolved. The careful invisibility fell away like a dropped coat. "Get him to Trauma Bay 2, Dr. Ashford called out from across the ER, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who'd never doubted himself in his life. He was already moving, already assessing, already reaching for the electronic clipboard that would document this patient's fight for survival. 2 large-bore 4s, type O negative running wide open, get me a fast exam and a CT pan scan. Hannah was already there. She moved past the junior nurses with the fluid efficiency of someone who didn't have time to ask permission, already wrapping the blood pressure cuff around the veteran's right arm, already assessing the damage with her eyes while her hands prepared the equipment. The femoral artery, she could see the pattern of the bleeding, the location of the wound, the way the blood wasn't spurting, which meant the artery itself had already begun to clot, but the vena cava was probably involved. Internal bleeding. The kind you couldn't see. The kind that killed people while they were still talking to you. "Rapid infuser on deck," she said quietly. Not a request. Not a question. An assessment of what needed to happen next. Dr. Ashford appeared across the patient's other side, and that was when Hannah saw it. His right hand dipped into his coat pocket for just a moment, less than a second, the kind of movement that existed at the edge of visibility. When his hand emerged, the pre-filled syringe was already palmed, already hidden against his palm with a practiced ease that made her stomach turn cold. His left hand continued working, continuing the assessment, his voice continuing the stream of medical directives to the nurses surrounding them. The syringe was small. Unmarked. The kind that someone might fill with something that wasn't on the hospital formulary. The kind that someone might introduce into and fall line during the chaos of a trauma, when everyone was focused on the monitor, on the bleeding, on the count of units infusing. Hannah's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. His expression didn't change. He didn't acknowledge that she'd seen anything. His gaze simply moved past her to the monitor as if she'd never been there at all, but something in that movement, something in the absolute certainty of his posture, told her that he knew exactly what she'd witnessed. She should look away. Professional protocol meant looking away, meant pretending she'd seen nothing, meant continuing to prepare the medications and the lines and the warming blankets that kept trauma patients from dying of hypothermia during their resuscitation. She should do her job. That was the agreement she'd made with herself the day she'd taken off her uniform and hung it in the back of a closet she no longer opened. But her eyes had other instincts. The veteran's face turned slightly as the nurses repositioned him for imaging, and something in his features struck her with the force of recognition. Not his identity, she didn't know him, couldn't know him. But something in the structure of his jaw, the way his hair had started to grey at the temples, the quality of his hands even unconscious and bleeding. Military hands. Soldier hands. The kind that had held something heavier than a stethoscope. For a moment that lasted longer than a moment should last, Hannah felt the ground shift beneath her. The ER didn't go silent, the monitors kept beeping, the nurses kept moving, the ventilators didn't pause, but something in her perception telescoped. The sounds became distant. The lights became sharper. The veteran on the stretcher stopped being a patient and became something else entirely. Someone. A connection to a world she'd spent 3 years carefully leaving behind. "Get the blood warmer running," Dr. Ashford said, and his tone carried the particular edge of someone who expected immediate compliance. "And someone get me a baseline lab panel. I want to know his hematocrit before we transfuse." Hannah moved. She always moved. That was the first rule of survival. You kept moving, you kept working, you kept your hands busy so your mind didn't have time to betray you with memories of explosions and mortality rates and the particular sound that blood made when there was too much of it pooling on sand. The elderly man's blood pressure displayed on the monitor in numbers that spelled out crisis, 64/38. Dropping. The red digit seemed to pulse with urgency, counting down toward something neither of them could see but both of them understood perfectly. 2 units of O negative, Hannah said, already spiking before tubing into the blood warmer. Starting now. Ashford's hand moved again, and this time she watched it more carefully. The pre-filled syringe was still there, still palmed, still waiting for a moment when the chaos would peak and everyone's attention would split 100 different directions. A moment was coming. The body on the stretcher was dying, and in the next few minutes someone would need to make a decision about what medications would go into the fall line that ran directly into the veteran's heart. Hannah understood suddenly, with the clarity of someone who'd seen worse than this in places that didn't exist on American maps, that she was watching a man decide whether another man would live. And she was the only one who could stop him. The overhead page crackles at 1,400 hours, and Ashford's voice floods every corridor of the 3rd floor like poison gas. Honorary to the nurses' station. Honorary to 3 North. Hannah's jaw tightens as 6 heads turn toward her simultaneously. The diminutive childhood nickname, the one her mother used, the one nobody here should know, hangs in the air like smoke. She sets down the patient chart and walks to the desk where Ashford leans against the counter, his smile surgical and patient. The fluorescent lights cast his face in institutional white. "You know, Honorary, I've been reviewing your charting." His voice is conversational, almost warm. Sloppy. Almost like you're distracted. Hannah takes one measured breath. Her hands remain steady at her sides. "My charting is accurate, Doctor." The tears threatening behind her eyes stay locked down, a military discipline so ingrained it feels biological. She survived worse than this in places that don't exist on American maps. She will survive this. Ashford's laugh is soft, the sound of someone who has never been told no by institutional power. "We'll see what the Quality Review Board thinks." 2 hours later, during the shift transition when the hallways thin to skeleton crews, Ashford corners her in the supply closet. His body blocks the door. The space smells of antiseptic and cardboard, close and suffocating. She stands perfectly still, waiting. "You're being moved tonight's effective Monday," he says, his voice dropping to the register of confidentiality, the voice used to deliver terminal diagnoses and career endings. Your performance issues require supervision. His eyes are patient as a predator's. Hannah meets his gaze without flinching. She has looked across rifle sights into worse. I've survived worse than you, doctor. She steps toward the door and his body shifts just enough to let her pass. Her shoulder brushes his lab coat. She doesn't turn back. That evening, during shift change, the San Diego sun hammers down on the asphalt parking lot like an interrogation lamp. 6 colleagues cluster near their cars, nurses Patricia and Mike, respiratory therapists James and Devon, 2 residents whose names Hannah has never bothered to remember because people rarely stay long enough to matter. Ashford appears from the employee entrance, his white coat immaculate, his stride the walk of someone who has never experienced consequences. Hannah. His voice carries across the lot. Everyone turns. You're off trauma team duties effective immediately. I'm sure you understand liability concerns. You'll handle intake paperwork from now on. The words land like body blows. Her colleagues won't look at her now. Patricia finds sudden interest in her phone. Mike's jaw clenches but he says nothing. One tear escapes Hannah's left eye and she wipes it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Ashford. Understood, she says. Her voice carries the flatness of someone who has reported casualties to families, who has held the dying in sand and darkness, who knows that composure is the only weapon left when everything else has been stripped away. She turns on her heel, spine straight as a surveyor's line, and walks to her Honda Civic. Whispers follow her like shrapnel. Poor Hannah. She must have really messed up. Did you see her face? She doesn't hear them. She's already gone. That night, at 2,147 hours, paramedics crash through Sacred Heart's emergency doors with an unidentified veteran, 60s, ribs visible through paper-thin skin, internal bleeding creating a dark stain across the left side of his trauma shirt. Hannah moves on pure instinct, muscle memory that predates her nursing license by 15 years. She starts a second for line 18 gauge in the left antecubital, while Ashford barks orders like he invented trauma medicine. 2 units ONEG stat labs. Get him to CT. The veteran's dog tags read Jade Morrison but nothing else. No wallet. No phone. Found collapsed outside the VA clinic on 5th Avenue. His pressure is 74/42 and dropping. He's breathing shallow. The smell of blood and diesel fuel clings to him like a second skin. In the chaos of hanging blood products and calling for type and screen, Hannah sees it. A movement so smooth it barely registers, Ashford's hand drifting from the medication cart to his lab coat pocket. A pre-filled syringe. 2 milliliters of clear liquid. The motion practiced, habitual, a theft performed 1,000 times before. Her stomach turns with recognition. She's seen diversion before. Saw a field surgeon lose his commission in Kandahar for exactly this, palming medications meant for patients, building a private pharmacy in a locked footlocker, watching eyes glaze as he chased the same numbness she understands too well. The veteran stabilizes on 4 units of blood product and they move him to ICU bed 6, 3rd floor. Hannah says nothing. She follows protocol. She documents the transfer in Morrison's chart with clinical precision, patient transferred to ICU in stable condition. Vitals responding to resuscitation. She does not document what she saw. Over the next 6 hours, Ashford's retaliation begins with surgical precision. He reassigns Patricia to the night shift. Calls Mike into his office and discusses opportunities for growth in other departments. Moves Devon to pediatrics. The 3 witnesses, the only people who saw what Hannah did during the trauma, are quietly redistributed like pieces on a board. He alters tomorrow's surgery schedule, ensuring that Dr. Patel and nurse supervisor Chen, his allies, his people, control the ICU. He makes a phone call at midnight to the hospital board president, his voice concerned and measured. We may have a liability issue developing with one of my nurses. I wanted you aware before it escalates. He doesn't mention what he saw her do. He doesn't mention that she probably saw him. Hannah doesn't hear any of this. She's reviewing Morrison's chart at 0300 hours when the monitor's flatline. The veteran's heart stops like a door slamming shut. She moves toward the bed, but Ashford is already there, blocking the crash cart with his body. "Step back, Hannah. I'll handle this." His voice is calm, authoritative, a command that carries the weight of institutional hierarchy. Hannah stands frozen for one heartbeat, two. The monitors scream their flatline song. Morrison's eyes are half open, staring at nothing. She has 15 seconds before brain death begins. "Doctor, he's coding." "I said step back." Ashford's hand moves toward the medication drawer. Reaches for something that isn't adrenaline. Something that will stop Morrison's heart rather than restart it. The clarity hits Hannah like a physical blow. He's not trying to save the veteran. He's trying to ensure the veteran dies quietly, without questions, without the possibility that Morrison might someday describe who brought him in, what he might have overheard. She moves. Not around Ashford. Through him. She grabs a scalpel from the crash cart and his eyes widen with genuine shock as she pushes past his shoulder. Her hands move on their own, 18 years of training, muscle memory carved into her bones in a place called Bagram where the only choice was competence or death. She makes the incision, left anterolateral thoracotomy through the fourth intercostal space. One cut. Clean. The ribs open like a book. Blood spills across her hands and up her forearms, warm and urgent and real. She finds the heart, fist-sized, the color of liver, and begins manual compressions. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The rhythm older than civilization. Morrison's oxygen saturation climbs, 64. 71, 81. 88. The monitor finds sinus rhythm at exactly 90 seconds. A pulse. A heartbeat. A life that refuses to end. Ashford stares from the doorway with his mouth open. "Call security," he says quietly. His hand is shaking. But that wasn't the worst part. That was just the beginning. The monitors started their descent at 0300 hours, and Hannah heard it from 3 floors below, not the physical sound, but the urgent chime of a code blue alert that cut through the air's fluorescent hum like a blade finding bone. The overhead announcement crackled, "Code blue, ICU, bed 7. Code blue, ICU, bed 7. Her hand stilled over the patient chart in front of her. Morrison. She didn't know his name yet, but her body knew what his flatlining meant. Muscle memory doesn't sleep. She moved before thought caught up. The stairwell door banged open and her boots, the same combat boots she wore under her scrubs, the ones with 847 miles of Helm and Province dust still ground into the seams, took the steps 3 at a time. Her heart had that specific rhythm it got in Bagram when the compound took incoming, fast, controlled, purposeful. This wasn't panic. This was the calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The ICU descended into choreographed chaos when she pushed through the doors. A resident was doing compressions on Morrison's chest, his technique all adrenaline and no finesse, ribs compressing too shallow. The ICU nurse, a woman named Chen, maybe 24, 6 months out of nursing school, was fumbling with the crash cart's medication drawer, her hands shaking so badly the ampules rattled like dice in a cup. The monitor showed flat line. Asystole. The most dangerous rhythm. No electrical activity. No pulse. No time. Hannah's eyes found the call button for the attending physician. Once. Twice. The intercom crackled and Ashford's voice emerged, thick with sleep and thick with something else, that particular tone of a man who hadn't wanted to be interrupted, stabilize and wait for morning rounds. "I'll be here in 15 minutes. The line went dead. Hannah's hand froze on the phone receiver. Around her, the code continued, chest compressions, medications being drawn up, the sound of a ventilator being prepared, but in that moment, the room felt like it had been underwater. She looked at the monitor, 0300 hours and 47 seconds. Flat line. She looked at Morrison's face, at the dog tags still visible above his hospital gown, at the veteran's eyes that would never open again if Ashford waited. She looked at Chen, whose eyes were now locked on Hannah's, searching for something. Permission. Guidance. Proof that someone knew what to do. "Doctor, he needs intervention now," Hannah said, her voice cutting through the code with the precision of a scalpel. Not a request. A statement. A doctor would recognize the tone. A smart doctor would have heard the rank underneath it, even in civvies. "That's an order, Nurse Clarke." His voice came back through the intercom, and now it carried something darker. Not irritation. Recognition. He'd known all along that she would move when everyone else froze. He'd been counting on it. The line went dead again. 60/0. Morrison's blood pressure had become a ghost, present in name only. The ICU nurse's face had gone the color of antiseptic. The resident kept compressions going, but Hannah could see it in his shoulders. He knew they were already in the land of the dead, performing rituals on a body that had moved beyond the reach of conventional medicine. 15 minutes. Maybe 20 if Ashford drove fast. Maybe 30 if traffic on the hospital campus was light. Morrison would be a cold body by then. Legally, definitively, irreversibly dead. Hannah's eyes moved to the crash cart. She saw the sterile pack, the scalpel inside it gleaming under the ICU's unforgiving lights. She saw Morrison's chest, still heaving from the resident's compressions but generating no blood pressure, no life, no hope of it. She saw the dog tags again, military issue, worn from decades of wear, the kind that had been around a human neck through things that left marks. She saw the choice hanging in front of her, sharp and clean as the blade she was about to reach for. Every protocol she'd agreed to. Every rule of her rebuilt civilian life. Every certification and credential and promise she'd made to keep her head down, to be invisible, to never let anyone see what lived underneath the scrubs. All of it balanced against 90 seconds and a scalpel and a veteran she didn't know. She moved. "Someone document this," Hannah said, her voice dropping an octave, the deferential nurse vanishing like smoke. "I'm going in." She snapped on gloves, the sound like a gunshot in the contained space of the ICU. The resident's compression stopped automatically. This was the moment where rank reasserted itself, where the invisible thing that lived in the way she moved made itself visible enough to be followed. She cracked open the sterile pack and lifted the scalpel, not standard procedure for an ICU bed, but nothing about what she was about to do followed standard procedure anymore. The field thoracotomy was muscle memory wearing the mask of muscle. Her hands moved like they were remembering Bagram, emergency surgeries in compounds under fire, casualties with seconds left on the clock, the kind of triage where you either saved them in the space between heartbeats or watched them die. 90 seconds. That was all the time she had before Ashford walked out of that elevator and saw what she'd done. She found the space between Morrison's ribs, the fifth intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and the scalpel went in with the kind of certainty that only came from having done it before. The chest cracked open like a door. Blood spilled hot and real across her gloves, and she didn't flinch. Pain was information. Blood was a map. She could read it like a language she'd learned in a place she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Her fingers found the bleeder, the descending thoracic aorta, what had been hemorrhaging into Morrison's chest cavity, what had stopped his heart from any oxygen reaching his brain. She clamped it. The bleeding paused like a held breath. She was wrist-deep in his chest cavity, her hands moving with the fluidity of someone who had done this exact thing under mortar fire while concussion shook the compound and someone screamed her call sign through the radio static. Morrison's heart stuttered. Once. Twice. A rhythm emerged from the nothing. Sinus rhythm. The monitor beeped. Not the steady, healthy rhythm of a man at rest, but it was life. It was the difference between a body and a memory. 90 seconds. The elevator dinged behind her. Ashford stepped out into the ICU, and his face moved through for expressions in sequence, shock at seeing her, calculation at understanding what she'd done, and then cold, predatory awareness that she'd just given him exactly what he needed. She was now the nurse who had performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. She was now the protocol violation incarnate. She was now the problem that could be solved with a single phone call. He walked toward the crash cart with the measured pace of a man who'd already decided what he was going to do. "Get away from that patient, Nurse Clarke," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd been holding in reserve since the moment she'd refused to break in front of his mockery, his humiliation, his carefully orchestrated campaign to make her quit. "Nobody move. Security is on the way." Hannah's hands were still inside Morrison's chest cavity. The monitors showed numbers climbing. Blood pressure building. O2 saturation rising. The ICU nurse, Chen, was staring at the vital signs, then at Hannah, then back at the vital signs, the universal expression of someone watching something medically impossible unfold at 3 in the morning. Hannah didn't move. Her eyes met Ashford's across the distance of the ICU bed, and something in her posture, something that had nothing to do with civilian nursing and everything to do with the rank she'd never spoken aloud, made him understand that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. The next sound was the elevator arriving again. But that wasn't security. The elevator doors opened on 3 and Dr. Ashford stepped into the ICU with the casual authority of a man who'd never been refused anything. His eyes found the trauma bay immediately. Hannah stood with her hands inside the veteran's open chest cavity, her fingers positioned around the descending aorta, controlling hemorrhage with the kind of precision that only came from muscle memory burned deeper than reason. The monitors showed a climbing oxygen saturation. 84. 87. Climbing. Ashford's jaw tightened. Not from concern for the patient. From rage that his plan had been violated by someone he'd already fired. He didn't approach the bay. Instead, he turned to the nearest nurse station and lifted the phone with the deliberate slowness of a man already constructing the narrative. His voice, when it came, carried the concerned tone of a senior physician reporting a critical patient safety incident. "We have a situation on 3. Unauthorized procedure. I need security at the ICU immediately. Major incident." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Authority doesn't raise its voice. Hannah didn't look up. Her fingers remained steady against the vessel. Pain was information. Everything in her body screamed at her to acknowledge what was happening, to defend herself, to explain the monitor numbers that told the truth her hands were writing in real time. She said nothing. The patient's blood was warm against her wrists. The hiss of the ventilator continued its mechanical rhythm. 89. 91. 93. Ashford moved to the window of the trauma bay and pulled his phone. The camera clicked, once, twice, 3 times. Hannah's hands inside Morrison's chest, captured in clinical clarity. Evidence. He slipped the phone away and made another call before the surgical team even arrived. His voice was grave now, the voice of a man deeply concerned about hospital liability and patient safety. He was calling the hospital board president at his home, waking him at 3 in the morning with news that would reshape the next 8 hours of Hannah's life. By 4:30, her credentials were suspended. By 6 o'clock, Ashford had called each board member individually, his voice carrying the weight of a physician who'd witnessed something deeply troubling. She performed a procedure she has no authorization for. Unauthorized surgical intervention. We're looking at a potential psychiatric episode, possibly untreated PTSD. He didn't lie. He just selected which truths to tell. He didn't mention the patient was alive. He didn't mention the monitors. He didn't mention that in 90 seconds, she'd done what no one else in the hospital had the courage or skill to attempt. The 3 nurses who'd witnessed the thoracotomy received their transfer assignments before dawn. One reassigned to pediatrics, her shift changed to days. One moved to outpatient surgery, a rotation that would keep her away from the ICU entirely. One transferred to overnight in the psychiatric unit, a message disguised as administrative efficiency. Ashford didn't give explanations. He simply altered the surgical schedule, ensuring that Morrison would be transferred to a specialized facility across San Diego by noon. The narrative would scatter before anyone could assemble it into something coherent. The witnesses would be separated. The patient would vanish. The evidence would become a discrepancy in hospital records. By 7 o'clock, when Hannah's shift technically ended, security was waiting at the ER entrance. Not aggressive. Professional. 2 officers in Navy uniforms with the careful politeness of people enforcing someone else's decision. They escorted her to the 4th floor without restraint, but the message was unmistakable. You don't walk out. You are walked out. The HR director's office smelled like cold coffee and industrial carpet. The walls were the color of resignation. A resignation letter lay on the desk, pre-printed with Hannah's name and employee ID number, as if her compliance had already been decided. The director, a woman named Patricia who'd never spoken to Hannah before today, slid the paper across the desk with the confidence of someone following a script. Sign this and we call it mutual separation. Benefits continuation, references, no litigation language. Everyone walks away clean. Patricia's eyes didn't meet Hannah's. They were looking at something just to the left of her face, the way people do when they're delivering bad news they've been instructed to deliver. Refuse and Dr. Ashford will file formal charges for gross negligence, unauthorized surgical intervention, and patient endangerment. That goes on your permanent record. Nursing boards in 3 states will see it. You'll never work in healthcare again. Patricia paused, then added the part she'd been told to emphasize: the patient is being moved to specialized care. Your intervention is being documented as a deviation from protocol that endangered rather than helped. Hannah's hands were still raw from the scrubbing. The antiseptic had burned through the first 3 layers of skin. She could see the redness creeping up her wrists, angry and honest. She didn't look at the resignation letter. She didn't look at Patricia. She simply existed in that moment the way she'd learned to exist in moments like it, present but unreachable, her silence more powerful than any word she could have chosen. I'll need your ID badge and parking pass. Patricia was reading from the script now, the difficult part over. Your final paycheck will be direct deposited. Security will escort you to collect your personal items from your locker. Hannah picked up the pen. The pen felt foreign in her hands, too light, too civilian, a tool that belonged to someone filing paperwork instead of someone saving lives. She signed the letter without reading it. The signature looked like it belonged to someone else, someone much smaller than she actually was. She placed the pen on the desk and pushed the letter back across the laminate. Okay, she said. The word hung in the air like a period at the end of a sentence that wasn't quite finished. That evening, she went down to the hospital laundry room in the basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of dying insects. The industrial dryers rumbled behind her like sleeping animals. Hannah moved to her locker, number 147, a number she'd opened 5,000 times, and pulled out her scrubs. 5 sets, folded with the precision of someone who still believed order mattered. She held them in front of her for a long moment, these cotton garments that had been her armor and her identity for 5 years. They smelled like the hospital, like antiseptic and blood and the particular exhaustion that only came from 12-hour shifts spent saving strangers. She unfolded them one final time. Her hands, the same hands that had held an M4 carbine, that had been trained to kill, that had been retrained to heal, creased the fabric one section at a time. Sleeve. Sleeve. Body. Waistband. The ritual of folding gave her something to do with her body while her mind tried to process the day. This was the final indignity. This was the last shred of the life she'd built, the one where she could pretend to be normal, where she could exist in a space that didn't require her to be Major Hannah Clarke, where she could just be a nurse. Just a nurse. The words Ashford had used about her, the dismissal she'd accepted because correction would have revealed something she wasn't ready to reveal. She was placing the final set of scrubs into the return bin when she heard the footsteps. Heavy. Wrong. Not the shuffle of a tired custodian or the clicking of a nurse's clogs. These were deliberate, measured, the kind of footsteps that moved with purpose that had nothing to do with hospitals or patients or the maintenance of human life. The man appeared from behind the industrial dryers. He was broad-shouldered, unremarkable in every way except for the 12-inch blade in his right hand. The knife caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a mirror. Hannah's military training recognized the grip, the angle, the body language of someone who knew exactly what he intended to do with that blade. She also recognized something else, the stairwell behind him that led to the 4th floor. The 4th floor where Morrison was being prepped for transfer. The 4th floor where a patient who'd survived a surgery he wasn't supposed to survive would be undefended for the time it took to move him from ICU to transport. The man lunged forward without a sound. No scream, no threat, no demand. Just motion and intention, and the blade moving in a trajectory that Hannah's body understood before her mind could formulate a response. She moved sideways, not away. She threw herself between the man and the stairwell entrance, her body a barrier that couldn't be crossed without going through her. The blade punched into her left shoulder first, the pain arriving as information, entry depth, angle, probable damage to the subclavian artery. Her body hit the wall. The man twisted the knife and withdrew it, repositioning for the next strike. Hannah didn't scream. She didn't call for help. Her right hand came up and found the attacker's wrist, her fingers closing around bone with the kind of pressure that would have broken it if she'd twisted. The blade came toward her abdomen instead, lower this time, and she couldn't block it. The knife punched through her right lower abdomen, just above the iliac crest. The pain was different this time, a hot, spreading sensation that meant serious tissue damage, possibly a ruptured organ, definitely blood loss she couldn't calculate precisely enough to know if it was survivable. The attacker wrenched the knife back out and turned toward the stairs. Hannah's hand came up again, this time finding his face, her fingers going for his eyes with the kind of ferocity that told him clearly he could kill her, but he would not reach that stairwell while she was breathing. He hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Someone had heard the commotion, a custodian 3 floors down, a nurse on break, someone in the labyrinth of the basement hospital infrastructure who understood that sound meant danger. Footsteps. Shouting. A radio call going out. The man released the knife, which clattered to the concrete floor still slick with Hannah's blood, and ran for the loading dock exit. Hannah went down to her knees. The blood spread across the concrete in a way she could measure, she was bleeding out, the damage was extensive, she had maybe 4 minutes before the blood loss became catastrophic. She pressed her right hand against the abdominal wound and realized with the clarity of someone whose training had prepared her for exactly this scenario that she wasn't going to get to the emergency room as a patient. She wasn't going to call for help. Someone else would arrive in the next 60 seconds. Someone else would be responsible for whether she lived or died. That someone else would have to choose whether she was worth saving. The basement door burst open. Footsteps. Multiple people. A voice she recognized calling her name with urgency that sounded almost like prayer. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent and eternal, as her vision began to narrow at the edges. The stretcher wheel squeaked against the polished tile of Sacred Heart's front entrance, and the November rain hammered the automatic doors like applause nobody asked for. Hannah Clarke sat in a wheelchair, not a patient, not yet, but not quite a nurse anymore either, with 2 drainage tubes running from beneath her dress like mechanical parasites keeping her from bleeding out on the plaza. Her shoulder throbbed with the kind of pain that belonged to another person, someone else's body. The scars on her hands from Bagram had company now. Fresh company. The unidentified veteran, Morrison, they'd finally told her his name was Morrison, sat 3 feet away in his own wheelchair, his color returning like someone painting a portrait back to life. 12 hours of post-operative recovery and a transfusion protocol that had eaten through for units of O-negative, but his eyes were open. Present. Alive because Hannah had cracked his chest with a trauma knife and held his heart like a medic holds purpose. The morning light caught his face at an angle that made him look both ancient and newborn. When their eyes met, the world compressed into a single point of contact. Morrison's lips moved. 3 syllables that detonated everything Hannah had buried in scrub pockets and sealed beneath department regulations. Phoenix. Her old call sign. The name that only breathed inside classified debrief rooms at Bagram Airfield, the designation that belonged to a major in 7th Special Forces Group before she became a woman in turquoise scrubs pushing medication carts. Her entire body froze, not trembling, not gasping, but the kind of absolute stillness that comes from recognizing your own ghost sitting across from you, asking for acknowledgement. The rain continued falling. The automatic doors whooshed open and closed with mechanical indifference. Morrison's daughter stepped forward with trembling hands that had been held too tight for 48 hours while her father bled and coded and came back wrong the first time before coming back right. She looked at Hannah with the kind of clarity that comes from watching someone put their fists into your parents' chest cavity and squeeze life back into them. "Major," she said. Not a question. A title. Recognition. The way you speak about something sacred. A nurse from the VA, a young, maybe 26, with the posture of someone still learning which burdens to carry, stepped forward with a file that Hannah recognized immediately. Her file. The one that shouldn't exist in civilian hospitals, the one that contained information classified deeper than most people knew how to dig. The nurse's voice shook as she read, Bronze Star for Valor in Combat Operations, Nangarhar Province. Pause. Her hands turned the page. Purple Heart, 2 counts, shrapnel from an IED, Bagram District. Another pause. Combat Medical Badge with Star for Medical Expertise Under Fire. The words hung in the morning air like a defibrillator had restarted time itself. Hannah's jaw clenched once. That was all. That was everything. The sound of boots on wet pavement. Not running. Walking in formation with the kind of precision that only comes from 5,000 hours of collective discipline. The rain parted around them like they were objects of mass that air pressure bent around. 150 Special Forces operators in dress uniforms, dress blue so crisp you could cut yourself on the creases, berets with the 7th Group emblem positioned exactly 1 finger width above the right eyebrow. They stood in ranks that extended from the entrance to the parking lot's far corner, uniforms wet and darkening in the rain, not a single person seeking shelter because this wasn't shelter weather. This was witness weather. Their commander stepped forward, a full colonel with 3 rows of ribbons across his chest and the kind of face that had made strategic decisions that killed people and saved others with equal weight. His voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. Major Hannah Clarke, 7th Special Forces Group, medical officer, distinguished service record spanning 12 years and 4 combat rotations. He continued like reading a document that had been waiting for exactly this moment. You carried the rank through fire and carried it after, invisible in a place that doesn't honor what you sacrificed. The colonel's eyes locked onto hers. Today, we make that visible. The ranks parted like a river opening at command. 290 officers and enlisted standing in the rain, bearing witness, becoming the architecture of recognition that no hospital floor could contain. Hannah didn't stand. Her body wouldn't permit it yet. But something inside her straightened anyway. 3 floors above the plaza, in a corner office overlooking this exact scene, Dr. Ashford's hands shook as they rested against his desk. He'd been watching the security monitors when the operators began arriving, first in dozens, then in clusters, then in the organized decimation of institutional power he'd spent 10 years assembling. His strategic mind worked through calculations that suddenly felt like math performed on a sinking ship. The IT department. He'd meant to check on Marcus Webb, the quiet tech who transferred from Memorial 3 months ago, the one who'd asked odd questions about security protocols and footage retention. By the time Ashford moved to his computer, Marcus Webb had already sent encrypted packages to 3 separate federal agencies. The files contained everything. The medication diversion. Ashford had been skimming opioids and benzodiazepines for 18 months, selling them through a clinic contact in Las Vegas for supplemental income that fed a Porsche habit and a mistress in Coronado. The parking garage meeting. The conversation with the hired attacker, a parolee named Curtis Dello who owed money to bad people and made his living in worse ways. The basement attack. Every frame of Hannah shielding Morrison's room with her own bleeding body. All of it. Time-stamped. Witnessed. Documented. Webb's cover email to the FBI, DEA, and State Medical Board read one line, from one veteran to another. By noon, federal agents arrived at Sacred Heart. They didn't approach Ashford's office. They went to the pharmacy first, where a pharmacist named Delores who'd worked there for 19 years suddenly found herself explaining discrepancies in controlled substance inventory logs. They went to the security office where Webb handed them a hard drive with 48 hours of continuous video. The medication logs told their own story, the bottles Ashford had accessed versus the doses documented in patient charts, the patterns that screamed deliberate deviation and systematic theft. The parking garage footage showed him meeting Dello twice, their conversation too quiet to hear but their body language unmistakable, transaction, agreement, intention. By evening, Ashford's hospital credentials were suspended pending investigation. By morning, his office was sealed with a federal banner that said evidence, do not disturb. The board of directors held an emergency meeting. The state medical board sent formal notification. The legal machinery, once engaged, began grinding with the immense patience of systems designed to destroy people systematically and with documentation. His medical license, the credential he'd spent 12 years earning, the title that had become his identity, the authority that let him reshape reality through institutional power, was revoked within 7 days. The revocation was permanent. Not suspended. Not under review. Revoked. The word carried weight like a judge's gavel hitting wood that would never echo back. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Marcus Ashford at a strip mall in El Cajon, 18 miles south of Sacred Heart, where institutional memory had finally released him into the wilderness of irrelevance. He sat behind a folding table with supplemental insurance brochures arranged in overlapping fans, his tailored suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost substance somehow, as though the man had been subtracted from his own clothes. His hands straightened documents nobody took. His voice pitched coverage to pedestrians who moved past without eye contact. His Rolex remained on his wrist. He hadn't been convicted yet, wouldn't be for another 4 months, but nobody asked to verify his legitimacy. They simply knew. The invisible knowledge that comes from bearing witness to someone's complete dissolution. That same morning, Major Hannah Clarke stood in her office at the San Diego VA hospital, wearing dress blues for the first time in 5 years. The space smelled like fresh paint and new institutional certainty. Her faded 7th Special Forces group patch, the one that had lived hidden in jacket lining, secret and sustaining, hung framed on the wall where it belonged. Not concealed. Not apologetic. Framed. A declaration. Morrison stopped by at 0900 hours, walking with a cane but walking, his daughter steering him with one hand while he used the other to shake Hannah's hand like they were sealing a contract written in blood and shared mortality. 3rd time this month, he said, and his smile was the kind of gratitude that belongs to people who've been given their heartbeat back. His daughter brought coffee every Friday. They sat in the waiting area and talked about Morrison's recovery, about the physical therapy schedule, about the life that extended now in ways no one had predicted 2 months ago. Webb transferred to VA Medical Systems 3 weeks later. He'd left his corporate IT job and taken a federal position managing health record systems for veterans. He and Hannah nod to each other in the cafeteria with the recognition of people who've been in the same kind of fire together, the kind that burns in silence. No words needed. Just the acknowledgement that exists between people who've chosen to stand when standing costs something. Hannah's new team was entirely composed of veterans, a physician assistant who'd flown Apache gunships, a trauma surgeon who'd worked in a FOB hospital in Kandahar, a surgical nurse who'd been a Navy corpsman with a combat action ribbon and hand steady as ballistic calibration. They treated her not as a quiet nurse who got lucky, not as the woman who'd cracked a patient's chest on instinct, but as Major Clarke. The operator. The one who'd taken 2 knife wounds and still maintained the perimeter, still prevented collateral damage, still saved the patient. The rank hung on her office door like a weapon that had finally found its purpose. A young corpsman named Santiago knocked on her door at 1430 hours, nervous in the way people are nervous when they're carrying something they don't know how to set down. He had a question about a patient case, a routine query, the kind that gave him permission to speak to a superior. But Hannah saw what lived beneath the question, that lost feeling, the dissolution that happens after you take off the uniform and discover the uniform was holding you together. He sat across from her with the posture of someone who'd forgotten how to breathe normally. Hannah remembered exactly that moment. Exactly that dissolution. When I left Bagram, she said, and her voice had changed somewhere in the past 6 months, deeper, authoritative, the voice she'd carried into operating theaters and command posts before she'd buried it beneath invisibility. I thought the rank meant nothing without the unit. Without the mission. Without the team. She paused while Santiago listened the way recruits listen to someone who's already survived something they're still afraid of. But then I learned something different. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. You're here. You're asking these questions. You're learning to carry people again. That's the rank that matters. That's the one you keep. Santiago nodded like something had shifted inside him, like permission had been granted to exist as both the person he'd been and the person he was becoming. He stood and thanked her and left with something like purpose returning to his shoulders. Hannah turned to look at the framed unit patch on her wall, at the photograph of her team from 2016 mounted beside it, at the citation that sat in a plaque beneath glass. The faded green and black fabric told a story nobody would ever fully know, a story that lived in the space between what happened and what could be spoken about. Outside her window, the San Diego sun moved across the VA campus where thousands of veterans walked, worked, recovered, and tried to remember how to live. She was one of them now. Finally. Completely. Home. If you've watched this far, you already know that the quiet person in the room might be the most powerful one. Subscribe to the Code Whisperers and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the ones who wear invisible ranks. Like this video if you believe in second chances, and comment, would you have saved him, or would you have walked away? The answer says everything about who you are.